The wind that swept across the plains of Wyoming carried with it the ghosts of promises. For Clara, it was a constant, mournful whisper that smelled of dust and sagebrush and tasted of unshed tears. 2 years. It had been 2 years since that wind had turned cold, stealing the warmth from her life and leaving behind only the biting chill of memory. She stood on the porch of the small cabin she refused to call hers alone, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains clawed at an endlessly blue sky. This land, this dream, was all she had left of him. Lone Star Creek Ranch wasn't much. A modest cabin, a sturdy barn, and 160 acres of stubborn soil that Lewis had sworn held the sweetest water in the territory. He had seen a future in the rust-colored dirt, a life built with calloused hands and unwavering love. Now, Clara's hands were the calloused ones, her knuckles raw from mending fences and hauling water, her heart scarred by the fight to keep his vision from turning to dust with him. Every sunrise was a battle, every sunset a lonely truce. The townsfolk in Redemption Creek whispered she was a fool, a grieving woman clinging to a ghost. Let them whisper. This land was a monument, and she would sooner break than let it fall. Her fiancé, Louis, had been the sun to her sky-warm, bright, and full of laughter that could make the wildflowers grow. He had ridden out that morning with a promise to be back by supper, his pockets full of paperwork to finalize their claim. He never returned. The official report was grim and brutally simple. A stagecoach ambushed by road agents. No survivors. They brought back a splintered strongbox and a blood-stained hat that she recognized as his. The world had ended for her that day, collapsing into a silent, colorless void. But grief, she had learned, was not a passive state. It was an active, breathing thing that demanded to be fought. And so she fought with every nail she hammered and every row she plowed. The ride into Redemption Creek was a necessity she dreaded. Supplies were low, and the credit at Miller's Mercantile was stretched thinner than a gambler's promise. As she guided her weary mare Dusty down the town's single-wide street, she felt the familiar stares. They were a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The widow who wasn't, the woman who refused to move on. She squared her shoulders, her chin held high. Let them look. Her sorrow was her own, a private, sacred thing not to be gawked at by idle eyes. The town was buzzing with an energy it hadn't had in months. Men gathered in small, tense knots outside the saloon, their voices low and urgent. Something was different. She saw it in the way Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of Ambrose's gold, nervously polished his badge. Then she saw him. He stood in front of the U.S. Marshal's office, a building that had been vacant for as long as she could remember. He was a tall man, built as solid as a mountain oak, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his dark duster. A U.S. Marshal, a real one. His presence was a stark declaration, a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of Redemption Creek, a scar, a pale, jagged line cut down from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a permanent map of past violence. His hat was pulled low, but it couldn't hide the intensity of his gaze as he surveyed the town, his eyes missing nothing. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a cold, hard stillness that spoke of a man long past hoping for the best in others. Clara tethered Dusty and moved toward the Mercantile, her gaze unwillingly drawn back to the stranger. He felt dangerous. Not in the way a cornered rattler was dangerous, but in the way a winter storm was impersonal, powerful, and inevitable. As she passed, he turned his head, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, their eyes met. The world tilted. It wasn't recognition, not exactly. It was something deeper, a jarring echo in the empty chambers of her heart. For a fraction of a second, the coldness in his gaze was replaced by something else, a flicker of raw, gut-wrenching pain that mirrored her own. It was so intense, so familiar, it was like looking into a distorted reflection of her own soul. The air left her lungs in a rush. She stumbled, a bag of flour slipping from her numb fingers and bursting on the boardwalk in a white cloud. Mortified, she knelt, her hands trembling as she tried to scoop up the mess. A pair of worn leather boots stopped beside her. "Allow me, ma'am," a voice said. It was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. Nothing like Lewis's clear, warm tenor. She looked up, straight into those storm-gray eyes again. Up close, they were even more unsettling. They were the eyes of an old man in a young man's body, haunted by things she couldn't begin to imagine. He knelt, his large hands easily gathering the torn sack. He didn't smile. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He simply fixed the problem with an efficient, detached grace. "Thank you, Marshal," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't look away from his eyes. There it was again, that ghost of a familiar ache. "Asterisk, who are you?" Asterisk, her heart screamed, a question her lips dared not form. "Be careful," was all he said, his gaze dropping from hers as he stood and handed her the ruined bag. The brief, almost imperceptible connection was severed. The wall of cold indifference was back in place, thicker than before. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more a dismissal than a courtesy, and turned away, striding back to his office without a backward glance. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt dizzy, disoriented. It's the grief, she told herself fiercely, forcing her feet to move into the mercantile. You're tired. You see him everywhere because you want to. But the explanation felt hollow. It wasn't Lewis she had seen. It was his pain, his soul, trapped behind a stranger's face. The thought was so absurd, so mad, that she felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her throat. She choked it down, paid for her supplies with the last of her money, and fled the town as if the devil himself were at her heels. From the shaded window of his office, Marshal Thomas watched her go. He watched until her small figure was just a speck against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The iron control he had spent 2 years forging threatened to shatter into a million pieces. The moment her eyes had met his, he had felt the world beneath his feet give way. Clara. Her name was a prayer and a curse on his tongue. She was more beautiful than his memory had allowed, her face thinned by hardship, but her spirit burning as bright and fierce as ever in her defiant green eyes. He had seen the confusion on her face, the flicker of impossible recognition. It had taken every ounce of his will not to reach for her, to pull her into his arms and confess the whole damnable truth. But he couldn't. The man she had loved, Lewis, was dead. He had died in a hail of gunfire in a dusty canyon, left to bleed out under the watchful eyes of Ambrose's men. But he hadn't died. He had clawed his way back from the brink, reborn as Thomas, a man with a different name, a scarred face, and a single, all-consuming purpose: vengeance. Ambrose had not only stolen his life and his future, he had made a threat that had become the bars of Thomas's prison. "If you ever show your face again," the cattle baron had sneered over his bleeding body, "the first thing I'll do is pay a visit to that pretty little fiancée of yours. I'll make sure her end is slow." That threat had kept him away. It had forced him to become a ghost, a federal marshal with a manufactured past, hunting the very man who had created him. Returning to Redemption Creek was the greatest risk he had ever taken, but it was the only way. He had to dismantle Ambrose's empire piece by piece, cut the head off the snake, and ensure Clara was safe forever. He let the curtain fall, plunging the room back into shadow. Seeing her today, hearing her voice, it was a torment worse than any physical pain. To protect her, he had to remain a stranger. He had to be the cold, hard lawman, even if it meant she looked at him with fear, or worse, with the same hatred she held for the men who had killed her Lewis. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. The ghost she saw in his eyes was real. It was the man he used to be, a man screaming to be let out. Days bled into a week, and the unsettling memory of the marshal's eyes refused to fade from Clara's mind. It clung to her thoughts like a burr on a saddle blanket, a constant, irritating presence. She tried to dismiss it as a phantom of her grief, but the feeling was too potent, too real. It spurred her to do something she hadn't done in over a year: confront Sheriff Miller. She found him exactly where she expected, sweating in his small, dusty office, his chair groaning under his weight. "Sheriff," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I'm here about Lewis again. About the ambush." Miller sighed, a great wheezing sound of practiced exasperation. He didn't bother to look up from the wanted poster he was pretending to study. "Miss Clara, we've been over this. It was road agents. A tragedy, to be sure, but a closed case." "It's not a closed case," she pressed, stepping closer to his desk. "Those men were never caught. No one even looked for them. You know as well as I do that Ambrose's land is the only way in and out of that canyon. His men must have seen something." The mention of Ambrose's name finally made the sheriff look up. A flicker of fear, quickly masked by annoyance, crossed his face. "Now you listen here. Ambrose is a respected man, the biggest employer in this county. He'll not go casting aspersions. I'd be careful with those kinds of accusations if I were you. A woman alone. It pays to be careful." The veiled threat hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Clara left the office with a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. It was the taste of corruption, of a town held in the palm of a powerful man's hand. Her last hope for justice had been a fool's errand. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, her frustration curdled into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The town was alive with whispers about the new marshal. They said he was asking questions, digging into land claims and freight manifests. They said he'd spent 2 days riding the perimeter of Ambrose's vast ranch. He was stirring the pot, and it was making dangerous people nervous. Miles away in the cool shade of a cottonwood grove by the creek, Marshal Thomas met with the only man who knew the ghost he truly was. Dakota, a Lakota scout whose face was a roadmap of wisdom and hardship, sat silently sharpening a skinning knife. His presence was calming, a steady anchor in the storm of Thomas's life. "The snake knows there is a mongoose in the henhouse," Dakota said without looking up. his voice a low rumble. "Ambrose's men watch you. They see the federal badge and they see a man who does not bend. They're asking who you were before you came here." Thomas hunkered down, picking up a flat stone and skipping it across the water's surface. "Let them ask. They won't find anything." Marshal Thomas was born in a file in Cheyenne 2 years ago. "A name and a paper are not a life," Dakota observed, his dark eyes finally meeting his friend's. "The life is still in you. I see it when you look toward her ranch. The spirit of Lewis fights the cage you have built." He gestured toward Thomas's face. "The scar changes your flesh, but it does not change your heart. It is a dangerous game to hunt the wolf while pretending you are not the sheep it came for." A muscle twitched in Thomas's scarred jaw. "It's the only way, Dakota. If Ambrose gets even a hint of who I am, he'll go after her. I have to be methodical. I have to build a case so airtight that not even his money can buy him out of a noose. Until then, she can't know. She has to believe Lewis is dead." He said the words like a penance, each one a fresh twist of the knife in his own gut. "To protect her from the wolf, you let her be savaged by grief," Dakota said softly. It wasn't a judgment, but an observation as clear and sharp as the blade in his hand. "Be careful the cage you have built for your spirit does not become your tomb." That evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, mirroring the tempest in Clara's soul. Rain fell in hard, angry sheets, turning the street to a river of mud. She had spent the afternoon listening to the town's gossip, piecing together fragments of information. The Marshal was investigating Ambrose. The ambush that took Lewis had happened on the edge of Ambrose's territory. The sheriff was protecting Ambrose. In her grief-stricken mind, the pieces connected into a dark and terrible mosaic. The new Marshal wasn't here by chance. He knew something. Perhaps he was even part of it, a cleaner sent to bury the last of the evidence. Her anger, fueled by 2 years of impotence and sorrow, finally boiled over. She had to know. She pulled her worn oilskin coat tight around her and marched through the deluge to the Marshal's office. A single lantern cast a lonely yellow glow from its window. She didn't knock. She threw the door open with a crash, startling the man inside. Thomas was at his desk, a map spread out before him, and he looked up in shock, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt at his hip. Rainwater dripped from Clara's hair and ran down her face like tears. Her eyes, green and fierce, burned with a righteous fire. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a fury that had been simmering for 2 years. Thomas rose slowly, his face an unreadable mask of stone, the shadows of the lantern playing over his scar. "Ma'am, I believe you have me at a disadvantage. Don't you ma'am me?" she spat, advancing into the room. "You ride into town, a ghost with no past, and you start digging around Ambrose's business. You're asking about land deeds and stagecoach routes. You're asking about the very day the man I was going to marry was murdered." His expression didn't change, but his gray eyes darkened. "I'm a U.S. Marshal. Investigation is my job, is it?" she cried, her control snapping. Her voice rose, raw and cracking with pain. "Or are you here to cover his tracks? Were you one of them? Did Ambrose pay you to make sure the truth stayed buried with my Lewis? Did you watch him die? Did you hold the gun?" Every word was a physical blow, and it took all his strength to stand there and take it, to not betray the agony her accusations caused him. He had to protect her, even from himself, especially from himself. "You've been listening to town gossip," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You should go home. It's not safe for you to be making these kinds of accusations." His cold dismissal was the final spark. The dam of her grief broke, and 2 years of unspeakable pain came roaring out in a single soul-shattering scream. "You killed the man I loved." The accusation hung in the air, vibrating with the force of her entire being. It was the primal scream of a heart broken beyond repair, and it struck him with more force than any bullet. He visibly flinched, the iron mask cracking for a second, revealing a chasm of pure, unadulterated anguish. His carefully constructed wall crumbled to dust. He took a half step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to comfort her, before he caught himself and let it drop. His throat worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a choked, ragged whisper. Stripped of all authority, all distance, it was the voice of a man drowning in his own sea of loss. He breathed, his stormy eyes locking with hers, filled with a sorrow so profound it stole the air from her lungs. "I lost him too." The words were not an admission of guilt, nor were they a denial. They were a confession of shared grief, spoken with a depth of pain that matched her own. Clara stared at him, her fury extinguished and replaced by a wave of dizzying confusion. She had expected a threat, a lie, a cold-hearted denial. She had not expected this. She had not expected to see, in the eyes of this hard, scarred stranger, the exact same desolation that greeted her in the mirror every morning. The rain hammered against the roof, the only sound in the sudden, deafening silence between them. The Marshal's words echoed in Clara's mind long after she had fled his office and galloped back to the isolating quiet of her ranch. Asterisk, I lost him too. Asterisk, the phrase was a splinter, working its way deeper into her consciousness with every passing hour. It offered no answers, only 1,000 more questions that swirled in a maddening vortex. The rain stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. Sleep was impossible. She sat at her small kitchen table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows, staring at the only photograph she had of Louisa's stiffly posed portrait from the town photographer, his smile genuine despite the formal setting. She had accused a federal marshal of murder, and he had responded with a confession of shared grief. It made no sense. If he were one of Ambrose's cronies, he would have threatened her or laughed in her face. If he were an honest lawman, he would have coolly denied her accusations and thrown her out, but he had done neither. Instead, he had let his mask slip, and for one devastating moment, she had seen a pain in his eyes that was as profound and bottomless as her own. The next day, a desperate, consuming need for answers drove her back to Redemption Creek. She wouldn't confront the marshal again. Instead, she began to dig. She started at the post office, asking Mr. Abernathy, a man whose primary food group was gossip, if Marshal Thomas received much mail from back east. Abernathy, polishing his spectacles, simply shook his head. Not a single letter, Miss Clara. Man's a ghost, far as I can tell. His credentials came by wire from the territorial governor in Cheyenne. Before that, nothing. Her next stop was the telegraph office. The young operator, barely a man, was intimidated by her intensity. She asked if there were any records, any personal communiques that might point to the marshal's history. The operator paled, stammering about federal privacy. But when Clara slid a precious silver dollar across the counter money she desperately needed for feed, his resolve softened. He checked his logs. The story was the same. All of Marshal Thomas's correspondence was official, coded, and routed through Cheyenne. There were no personal messages, no family inquiries, no connections to a life before 2 years ago. He hadn't just arrived in town. He had seemingly been conjured out of thin air on the very month Louis had died. The coincidence was too great, a screeching disharmony in the quiet song of her grief. Her suspicion morphed into a burning obsession. This man, this scarred, silent marshal, was the key. He wasn't just connected to Louis's death. He was the center of the entire mystery. As Clara was chasing ghosts in town, Thomas was facing his own. The confrontation with her had left him raw, his defenses shredded. He rode out to the bluffs overlooking the valley, the place where he and Dakota often spoke freely. He knew he was close to breaking. The strain of seeing her, of feeling her pain and being unable to soothe it, was becoming unbearable. Dakota was waiting for him, a thin trail of smoke rising from his pipe. He watched Thomas dismount, his movements stiff with tension. "The woman with eyes of the spring meadow came to you," Dakota stated, "not a question. I saw her ride from your office as if chased by spirits." Thomas sank onto a rock, burying his face in his hands. The sound that escaped him was a ragged groan of pure agony. "I almost told her, Dakota. She stood there looking at me with such hatred and such pain. She thinks I was one of them. She thinks I killed him." He looked up, his gray eyes pleading for something, absolution, understanding, anything. "I can't do this. Every minute I'm here is a lie. I have to tell her the truth." "And the cattle baron's threat?" Dakota asked gently, his voice a steadying force. "Has the wolf lost his teeth?" "No," Thomas admitted, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The full, ugly story finally spilled out of him, a torrent of poison he had held inside for 2 years. It wasn't just a random ambush. Ambrose wanted my land, our land. He explained how he'd discovered a hidden spring deep in a ravine on his property, a source of water so strong it could sustain a herd through the driest summer. In this arid territory, it was more valuable than a gold mine. Ambrose had made him an offer, then a threat. Louis had refused. "He planned the whole thing," Thomas continued, his voice thick with remembered horror. "His men hit the stagecoach. They weren't there for the strongbox. They were there for me. They shot me and left me for dead in a ditch. I remember Ambrose standing over me, laughing. He told me he'd take the land, and if I ever came back, if I even breathed my name in this territory again, he would visit Clara and make her pay for my stubbornness." He described in detail what he would do to her. Thomas shuddered, the memory still sickeningly vivid. "I survived. A trapper found me. It took months to heal. The man I was, Louis, had to die so that Clara could live. I became Thomas. I used my savings to grease the right palms, to build a new identity, to become a marshal so I could come back and destroy him legally, permanently." Dakota listened in profound silence, his pipe smoke curling into the still air. "So, you wear the face of a stranger to protect the woman who loves the face you lost. The path you walk is one of great honor and great pain. But the wolf is growing restless. Ambrose knows you are digging at the roots of his rotten tree. He will not wait for it to fall. He will strike at what he thinks is your weakness." Dakota's words were prophetic. In his opulent ranch house, Ambrose swirled a glass of whiskey, his cold eyes narrowed. The Marshal was a problem, a federal nuisance that his paid-off sheriff couldn't swat away. And that girl, Clara, was still clinging to that worthless patch of dirt, the very land that held his prize. He had heard she was seen snooping, asking questions again. It was time to tie up loose ends. He called over two of his most ruthless hands, men with dead eyes and trigger-happy fingers. The girl on the Old Creek Ranch, Ambrose said, his voice flat and cold. She's become a liability. Ride out there tonight. Burn the cabin. Make it look like an accident, if she gets in the way. Accidents happen. That night, Thomas couldn't rest. A primal protective instinct screamed at him. He saddled his horse and rode out under the cover of darkness. Not to Clara's ranch, but to a high ridge that overlooked it. It was a ritual he'd performed more nights than he could count, a secret vigil over the woman he loved. He watched the single light in her cabin window, a tiny beacon of warmth in the vast, dark expanse, and his heart ached with a longing so fierce it was a physical pain. He was about to turn back when he saw them, two riders, moving without lights, their forms like dark smudges against the landscape. They weren't lost travelers. They moved with a predatory purpose, straight for Clara's ranch. Ice flooded Thomas's veins. Dakota was right. Ambrose had struck. He spurred his horse, flying down the ridge in a reckless, desperate race against time. Inside, Clara had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. A sudden, violent splintering of her front door jolted her awake. Two hulking figures filled the doorway, their faces shadowed by their hat brims. One held a lit torch. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. "Evening, ma'am," the first man sneered, stepping inside. "Mr. Ambrose sends his regards. Says this land is due for a change of ownership." Before she could scream, the second man lunged, grabbing her from behind, his hand clamping over her mouth. She struggled wildly, kicking and clawing, but he was immensely strong. As he dragged her toward the center of the room, the first man tossed the torch onto a pile of curtains. Flames erupted with a hungry roar. Suddenly, the night outside exploded with the crack of a gunshot. The man holding the torch grunted and collapsed, a dark hole appearing in his chest. The second man spun around, dragging Clara with him as a human shield, his pistol drawn. Marshal Thomas stood in the shattered doorway, a silhouette against the growing inferno, his Colt smoking in his hand. "Let her go," Thomas commanded, his voice a low, deadly growl she had never heard before. The man holding her laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. He pressed the cold barrel of his gun to her temple. "You drop that gun, Marshal, or the girl gets it first." Thomas's face was a mask of pure fury. In that split second, all his planning, his careful identity, his 2 years of agonizing restraint burned away in the flames. There was only Clara. As the gunman adjusted his grip on her, Thomas moved. He didn't shoot. He lunged forward with a speed that was terrifying. He slammed into the man, grabbing his gun arm. With a brutal efficiency, he twisted the man's wrist outward, a sharp, precise motion that sent a sickening crack through the air and the pistol clattering to the floor. The world stopped for Clara. The flames, the smoke, the terror, all faded into a roaring in her ears. That move, that specific, peculiar way of disarming someone. She had seen it 100 times. In the barn, laughing, as Lewis taught her how to defend herself. Asterisk, they grab you, you don't pull away. Asterisk, his voice echoed in her memory. Asterisk, you go with it. Grab the wrist, Clarabelle, and turn it out. It'll break before it bends. Asterisk, the fight was over in seconds. The second man was unconscious on the floor. Smoke was filling the cabin. Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, his face grim. "We have to get out." But Clara stood frozen, her feet rooted to the floor. She stared at him, at the scarred face of the stranger who had moved with the muscle memory of her dead fiancé. Her gaze traveled from his frantic storm-gray eyes to the hand that had just saved her. She saw it all in a blinding flash, the ghost of familiarity in his eyes, the impossible depth of his grief, his cryptic words in the office, and now this intimate piece of their shared past resurrected in a moment of life-or-death violence. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a picture so impossible, so heartbreaking, so beautiful that it couldn't be real. The roar of the fire was nothing compared to the roar in her own head. She looked up at his face, at the scar that had hidden him from her, and whispered a name she had thought was lost to the grave forever. A question that was a prayer. Lewis? The name hung in the air between them, more real than the smoke, more powerful than the fire. Lewis? Loose for a heartbeat, the world stopped turning. The hardened mask of Marshal Thomas shattered completely, and in its place was the face of the man she had loved, a face etched with 2 years of unspeakable agony. The storm in his gray eyes was not of anger or duty, but of pure, unadulterated love and regret. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod, a confession that broke them both. The roar of the flames brought them back. "Clara, we have to move," he yelled, his voice raw, the familiar timbre of Lewis cutting through the raspy tone of Thomas. He grabbed her hand, and this time she didn't resist. He pulled her out of the burning cabin and into the cool, dark night, away from the collapsing structure that had been her sanctuary and her prison. They stumbled to a stop near the water trough, the inferno casting a demonic, dancing light on their faces. Clara wrenched her hand from his grasp, her body trembling with a violent storm of emotions. Relief so profound it made her weak ward with a white-hot spear of betrayal. "You were alive," she whispered, the words barely audible. Then her voice rose, cracking with the force of 2 years of pent-up anguish. "You were alive. I mourned you. I buried an empty box and cried over it until I had no tears left. Every day has been a fight, a hell of loneliness, and you were alive." She struck his chest with her fists, the blows landing with desperate futility against his solid frame. "Why? Why would you do this to me?" He let her hit him, his face a canvas of torment, accepting her rage as a penance he more than deserved. When her energy was spent and she was sobbing, her forehead resting against his chest, he finally wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "To keep you alive," he choked out, burying his face in her hair, the scent of her, of wood smoke and home, overwhelming him. "That was the only reason. I swear it, Clara." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his hands framing her tear-streaked face. "Ambrose left me for dead. He stood over me and told me that if I ever returned, if you ever learned I was alive, he would come for you. He said he would make you pay for my life. Becoming Thomas, letting the world think Lewis was dead. It was the only way I could protect you while I found a way to destroy him for good." He traced the scar on his face with his thumb. "This was the price. And every day without you was 1,000 times worse than the wound that made it." Her anger began to dissolve, washed away by the undeniable truth in his voice, by the sheer agony in his eyes. This wasn't a man who had abandoned her. This was a man who had sacrificed his entire existence for her. The ghost she'd seen wasn't a trick of her mind. It was him, trapped, watching over her from a distance. The depth of his love, his sacrifice, was staggering. "Lewis," she breathed, her hand coming up to touch his scarred cheek. It was real. He was real. He was here. All the pain, the loneliness, the struggle, it all melted away in the face of this impossible miracle. She surged forward, her mouth finding his in a kiss that was a collision of sorrow and joy, of past and future, of two souls finally finding their way back to one another. It was a desperate, drowning kiss, a confirmation that this wasn't a dream. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. A dozen riders crested the nearby hill, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. At their head was the unmistakable, broad-shouldered figure of Ambrose. "Looks like my boys couldn't handle one little fire," Ambrose's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with venomous amusement. His eyes fell on the two of them, illuminated by the firelight, and a look of stunned disbelief twisted his features, quickly replaced by pure rage. "Well, I'll be damned. Came back from the dead, did you? I should have done the job myself the first time." Lewis pushed Clara behind him, his body a shield, the Marshal's Colt seeming to leap into his hand. "It's over, Ambrose. Your whole rotten empire is coming down." Ambrose laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "This town is mine, and now so is your woman. Kill them both." But before his men could raise their rifles, a shot rang out from the darkness of the rocks behind the barn. One of Ambrose's riders cried out and toppled from his horse. A second shot followed, and then a third. It was Takota, appearing as if from the earth itself, his rifle spitting fire with deadly accuracy, sowing chaos in the riders' ranks. "The barn," Lewis yelled, grabbing Clara's hand and pulling her toward the cover of the sturdy structure. He shoved a rifle into her hands from the tack room, just like we practiced. "Stay low and make every shot count." The next few minutes were a maelstrom of gunfire, shouting, and the terrified whinnying of horses. Lewis moved with the deadly grace of a man who had spent 2 years becoming a weapon. His Marshal's training fused with a raw desperation to protect his world. But Clara was not the girl he had left behind. 2 years of self-reliance had forged steel in her spine. She knelt by a gap in the boards, the rifle firm against her shoulder, and fired with a steady hand, her shots driving Ambrose's men back from their charge. Ambrose, enraged, dismounted and advanced on the barn, using a water trough for cover. He saw a flicker of movement near the main doors, Clara reloading. He raised his own rifle, taking careful aim. Lewis saw it. In that terrifying, silent moment where the world slows down, he saw the glint of Ambrose's rifle barrel, the cold certainty in his eyes, and the woman he loved directly in its path. There was no time to think, only to act. With a guttural cry, he threw himself in front of her. The impact felt like a sledgehammer hitting his side, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Clara screamed his name, a sound of pure terror. That sound fueled a fire in him hotter than the one consuming their cabin. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain in his ribs, he raised his Colt and fired twice. Ambrose staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face before collapsing into the dust, his reign of terror finally at an end. His remaining men, seeing their leader fall, broke and fled into the night. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire and Clara's frantic sobs as she knelt beside Louis. "You're hit! Oh God, Louis, you're hit!" "It's all right, Clarabelle," he gasped, his hand covering the bloody tear in his side. "It's all right." He missed anything important. He looked up at her, his vision swimming slightly, but all he could see was her beautiful, terrified face. "I told you I'd always come back to you." Dakota was suddenly there, his calm presence a balm. He quickly assessed the wound. The bullet passed through. "It will hurt like the devil, but it will not kill you." As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gray, they sat together beside the smoking ruins of the cabin. Dakota had bandaged Louis's side, and the pain had subsided to a dull, throbbing ache. Marshal Thomas, the ghost born of vengeance and fear, was gone. Louis was here, alive and solid beside her. He looked at the charred foundation, the ashes of their first dream. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he whispered. "I'm sorry for all of it." She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his, a simple act that felt like the mending of the world. "Don't be," she said, her voice clear and strong. "That was just wood and nails. We're the foundation, and we can rebuild." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the girl he'd left, but the incredible woman who had survived, who had fought, who had kept their dream alive on sheer will alone. He was home. The long, cold night was finally over, and a new day was dawning. True love is not measured by presents, but by the depth of sacrifice made in its name. It proves that even when faced with the illusion of death and the pain of separation, the strongest bonds can be rebuilt from the ashes, stronger and more profound than before. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.